They saw a filthy beggar stumbling toward their campfire, and they laughed. A tall, scrawny drifter in tattered clothes, face caked in dust, hat slumped over his eyes, hardly a threat. The two outlaw brothers lounging outside their mother's remote cabin had spent months on the run. They'd gunned down anyone who came after them and boasted that no lawman alive could ever catch them out here in the wilds of Indian Territory. Now, as dusk settled, they found it amusing that this ragged old Negro wanderer had appeared from the brush begging for food. Smirking, one brother tossed the tramp a half-eaten biscuit. The other kicked over a tin cup of water toward him. They sneered at his muttered thanks and watched in mockery as the dirty beggar hungrily devoured the scraps at their feet. In their eyes, he was just another desperate nobody, beneath even their contempt. Inside the cabin, their aged mother took pity and invited the vagrant to sleep by the hearth for the night. The brothers exchanged amused glances. If this fool made one wrong move, they'd kill him before he could blink. But the beggar just nodded gratefully and huddled near the fire, silent and obedient. What none of them understood, not the cocky outlaws, not even their kindly mother, was that this penniless drifter was no ordinary wanderer. Beneath the grime and frail frame lay coiled strength and steely intent. Hidden under his threadbare coat, a revolver gleamed within easy reach. And in his pocket, carefully wrapped to avoid notice, was a folded piece of paper bearing two names, the very names of the brothers now dozing unawares in their beds. That beggar was no beggar at all. He was the law, come to collect. Midnight passed. The fire burned low. In the darkness, the old man by the hearth opened his eyes. Gone was the dull, pleading gaze of a hungry drifter. In its place was a cold, unyielding focus. He rose without a sound, drawing the heavy iron handcuffs from his sack. Before the brothers could stir, the stranger pounced. A flash of steel, a rapid clink of iron. And when the outlaw brothers jolted awake, their wrists were shackled together. They stared in confusion at the silhouette looming over them. The frail beggar had somehow transformed, standing tall and imposing, as if the night itself had shed his disguise. In the glow of the dying embers they saw not a bent old vagrant, but a formidable figure with broad shoulders and a commanding presence. His voice, calm and deep, cut through their panic. "You boys are under arrest." The brothers lunged for their guns, but the man was faster. In a blur, he drew a Colt revolver from beneath his ragged coat. The muzzle glinted as it swung between them. "Don't," he said quietly. Faced with that steady aim, the outlaws felt their bravado drain away. How could this be? This was the same wretch they'd laughed at hours before. Yet now he moved with the authority of a seasoned manhunter. With their hands chained and a pistol trained on their hearts, escape was impossible. Only then did the stranger reach under his coat and pull out a 5-pointed badge. He wiped a smear of dirt from his jaw, revealing a resolute face and a fierce mustache catching the firelight. "My name," he said as he fixed the astonished men with an unforgiving stare, "is Bass Reeves, Deputy United States Marshal." In that moment, the outlaw brothers understood their mistake, the worst mistake of their lives. They had invited the most feared lawman in the West right into their den. The beggar they had mocked now held their fate in his hands. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the two fugitives were trudging in chains before Bass Reeves's horse, led at gunpoint on a 20-mile march to the nearest jail. They spent those cold dawn hours in disbelief, cursing their folly, terrified and humbled by the legendary deputy who had outsmarted them so completely. And they were far from his only captives. Scenes like this had played out again and again across the untamed territories, as outlaw after outlaw learned too late that underestimating Bass Reeves was a deadly error. By the time Bass Reeves hung up his guns for good, he would have arrested more than 3,000 criminals, 3,000 men and women who had terrorized the frontier, and shot down 14 deadly outlaws who gave him no choice but to kill. He achieved all this in an era with no radios crackling for backup, no squad cars or modern forensics. Just one man of uncommon courage, riding alone with a badge and an iron will. His exploits seemed so improbable that they border on myth, yet every word is true. This is the story of how a man born into bondage became the greatest lawman of the Old West, a story almost lost to history. But to understand how Bass Reeves rose from slavery to strike fear into the hearts of desperados, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to the cotton fields of Arkansas, where a legend was born in chains. July 1838. Crawford County, Arkansas. In a crude one-room slave cabin on the western frontier of the Deep South, a baby boy drew his first breath in the searing heat of summer. The child's mother cradled him in exhausted arms while outside, insects hummed and cotton plants swayed under a relentless sun. He was born into a world that saw him not as a child to cherish, but as property to be exploited. His first name was Bass, after his grandfather, but his surname was not his own. It belonged to the family that owned his parents, the Reeves family. From the moment Bass Reeves opened his eyes, his life was bound in chains, literal and figurative. Slavery in 1830s Arkansas was a brutal fact of life. Babies like Bass weren't recorded in family Bibles or celebrated. They were tallied on inventory lists alongside mules and plows. The Reeves plantation, perched on the edge of Indian Territory, was a place of ceaseless labor and constant fear. Bass grew up hearing the crack of whips and the groans of weary field hands picking cotton from dawn to dusk. He watched his mother endure the daily humiliations of being regarded as livestock. He saw his father bow and scrape to the whims of white masters, knowing that any misstep could mean a beating or worse. Cruelty was the air they breathed, submission the lesson taught from the cradle. When Bass was about 8 years old, the plantation master, an Arkansas legislator named William Steele Reeves, uprooted the entire enslaved household and moved south to the wide, open prairies of North Texas. Young Bass was loaded into a wagon with the rest of the property, carted hundreds of miles west to Grayson County, Texas. There, the Reeves set up a new homestead in the Peters Colony, and Bass's life of servitude ground on. As a boy, he tended horses, worked in the stables and cotton fields, and became known for his sturdy build and quick reflexes. But no matter how strong or clever he was, Bass was still a slave. The law of that time offered him no more rights than a stray dog. On the Texas frontier, Bass learned to ride and shoot, skills that would one day save his life. But then they were simply chores assigned by masters who saw him as a useful tool. Perhaps they noticed the boy's keen eye and steady hand and allowed him to hunt game for the kitchen or break in wild horses. Bass had a natural aptitude with animals and firearms, a calm steadiness even as a youth. But any talent he possessed unfolded under the yoke of bondage, with every achievement credited to someone else's profit. By the time he reached his early 20s, Bass Reeves was tall and powerfully built, 6 feet 2 inches of muscle hardened by years of back-breaking toil. In another life, he might have been looking to build a farm of his own or learn a trade. In this life, he was learning a far harsher lesson: how to survive under an absolute authority that saw him as nothing more than chattel. And soon, that authority would demand even more of him. In 1861, civil war erupted in America. The country split in two, and with it came a chance for Bass's bondage to perhaps crack or to tighten even further. Bass's master's son, George R. Reeves, was by then a prominent man, a Texan sheriff and politician who raised a company for the Confederacy. As was the custom, he brought along his best servant to tend him during the war. That servant was Bass Reeves. Bass was forced to march to war at his master's side, not as a soldier with a cause, but as personal property following his owner into battle. He cooked meals, tended horses, cleaned weapons, and pitched camp for the Confederate officer who claimed to own him. The irony was stark. Bass Reeves, a black man, was being made to support a rebellion fighting to keep black people like him in chains forever. Between 1861 and 1862, on battlefields stained with blood and in muddy campgrounds filled with desperate, homesick soldiers, Bass served George Reeves as ordered. But the chaos of war has a way of upending the normal order of things. In the fog of conflict, the strict rules of society can loosen, and opportunities for the daring can appear. Sometime during those war years, as the story goes, Bass and George sat by a campfire after nightfall, passing time with a game of cards. The flames cast long, flickering shadows as master and slave played hand after hand. Bass, ever observant and keen, noticed the arrogance in his master's demeanor, the absolute certainty that he could not possibly lose to someone he considered inferior. Perhaps a few dollars or a bottle of whiskey were at stake. As the game wore on, George Reeves began to suspect Bass was winning more than he should. His pride pricked. The white officer accused Bass of cheating. Voices rose in the still night. George's face flushed with anger at the mere suggestion that a slave might beat him honestly. He stood up, livid and cursing, and moved to strike Bass, maybe to backhand him across the face, or worse. In that instant, something in Bass snapped. He had endured years of servitude and abuse, but he was a grown man now, strong and unbowed in spirit. He blocked the blow and struck back hard. His fist connected with George Reeves's jaw, sending the man tumbling to the ground. For an enslaved man to lay hands on his master was the ultimate act of defiance, a capital offense in the slaveholding South. Both men froze, shocked at what Bass had done. Then George scrambled up, reaching for his pistol or shouting for help. Bass knew that if he stayed, he'd be tortured and executed in short order. In that split second, Bass Reeves made the fateful decision to run. Heart pounding, Bass bolted into the darkness of the woods, leaving his former master dazed and hollering after him. Bullets might have whistled past, or maybe the night was too chaotic for the Confederates to give chase. Either way, Bass vanished into the darkness, a fugitive not just from an army, but from slavery itself. With that single punch and desperate flight, Bass Reeves emancipated himself long before the nation officially would. He chose to risk death as a free man rather than endure one more day as a slave. Bass fled into the untamed expanse of Indian Territory, the vast wilderness that is now Oklahoma, beyond the immediate reach of Confederate patrols. Indian Territory was a strange sanctuary, a place technically outside U.S. state jurisdiction, governed in part by the 5 civilized tribes, but also rife with its own dangers. For someone in Bass's situation, though, it was the only refuge nearby where slave catchers and soldiers might hesitate to follow. Under the silent stars, Bass Reeves slipped into a new life. In that rugged territory, Bass found shelter and unlikely allies among the Native American tribes. He first took refuge with Creek and Seminole families, who understood what it was to be driven from your home, to be persecuted. They gave the weary young man food, a place to sleep, and something priceless, acceptance. Among them, Bass was not a piece of property. He was just a man, another soul making his way through a hard world. In the months and years that followed, Bass Reeves lived among the Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek peoples, learning their customs and languages. Around council fires and hunting parties, he absorbed the wisdom of the frontier. How to track a panther on soft ground, how to navigate by the sun and stars, how to hide oneself in tall grass or thick forest. His already formidable skills as a hunter and rider were refined to a razor's edge. He became fluent in several native languages, a rare and invaluable skill few outsiders possessed. Bass was essentially undergoing a second, far more liberating education in the wild, one that taught him how to be self-sufficient and cunning in ways no formal schooling ever could. By 1863, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had declared all enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free. On paper, Bass's bondage was broken. In reality, he had broken it himself by daring to resist and run. He remained in Indian Territory through the rest of the Civil War, surviving hand-to-mouth, a lone black man among native nations. He witnessed that turbulent land during a tumultuous time. Bushwhackers and deserters skulked in the woods, and battles sometimes spilled over into the territory. But Bass Reeves endured. He not only survived, he thrived, becoming as much a part of the terrain as the prairie wind. When the Civil War finally ended in 1865, Bass Reeves was truly free by law, 27 years old and brimming with rough frontier knowledge. He left Indian Territory and returned briefly to Arkansas, a free man stepping back into the society that once enslaved him. Not long after, he headed just over the border to Van Buren, Arkansas, near the banks of the Arkansas River that separated the state from Indian Territory. Bass likely chose Van Buren because it was familiar ground, and nearby Fort Smith was a bustling town where opportunities might arise. In Van Buren, Bass Reeves set about building the life that had been denied him for so long. He married a woman named Nellie Jenny, a young black woman of strength and compassion. The year was 1864, and amid the violence of war, two former slaves found a tender personal peace in their union. After the war, Bass and Nellie started a modest farm. The soil he plowed now was his own, or at least rented on his own account, not the field of a master. Bass worked that land with the same determination he had applied to everything else. He and Nellie began raising a family that would eventually include 10, even 11 children. Bass built a cabin, tilled crops of corn and vegetables, tended livestock. These were humble tasks, but for Bass, each must have felt like a triumph. Every fence post he drove into the ground was a stake in the new life he had wrested from fate. Those early Reconstruction years were not easy. The South was lawless in many places, seething with resentment, and the border areas near Indian Territory were especially unsettled. Outlaws and renegade bands roamed freely back and forth across the river, stealing horses, robbing homesteads, and menacing settlers. Bass Reeves's farm was close to this boiling pot, and inevitably he would have been touched by the troubles of the region. Perhaps he acted as an unofficial protector in his community. His neighbors knew he was skilled with a gun and fearless. We can imagine local farmers coming to Bass for help tracking down a stolen cow or guarding a wagon train through a risky stretch. Each time, Bass likely obliged, quietly building a reputation as a capable, dependable man to have in a pinch. Bass persevered through those lean years, surviving droughts, lean harvests, and the ever-present racial hatred that still lingered around him. He kept one eye on providing for his own brood and another on the chaotic world beyond his fence. By the early 1870s, the Reeves family was getting by, if not thriving. Bass was in his mid-30s, a time when many men contemplate slowing down, but fate was about to call him to a far greater purpose. Indian Territory in the 1870s was spiraling into lawlessness. The same refuge that had harbored Bass during the war had become a haven for the worst sort of desperados. Murderers, thieves, and fugitives from every corner of the country slipped into the territory, knowing that in this jurisdictional no-man's land, federal and state authorities had limited reach. The Native American nations had their own laws, but could only enforce them on their citizens, not on the influx of outlaws hiding among them. Violent crime spilled over the borders. The once sleepy frontier outpost of Fort Smith, Arkansas, right across the river, was inundated with reports of mayhem, brutal highway robberies, murders of itinerant peddlers, gangs of bandits tormenting small settlements with impunity. By 1875, Washington, D.C. decided that enough was enough. The federal government moved to bring the hammer down on Indian Territory's outlaw element. They appointed a new federal judge for the Western District of Arkansas, which had jurisdiction over the territory. His name was Isaac C. Parker, and he would earn a notorious nickname in years to come, the Hanging Judge. Parker was determined to restore order, and he knew it would take an army of extraordinary men to do it. He directed his newly appointed U.S. Marshal, James F. Fagan, to hire 200 deputy U.S. Marshals, an unprecedented number, and send them into Indian Territory with warrants and rifles to enforce the law. James Fagan had heard whispers of a man who might be perfect for this perilous task. Rumors spoke of a tall, unflinching black man who knew the territory like his own backyard, who spoke the languages of the tribes, who could track like a wolf and shoot like an army sharpshooter. This man's name was Bass Reeves. To Parker and Fagan, Bass's race was secondary to his skills. If he truly was as good as they'd been told, he was exactly what they needed. When Fagan came to recruit him, Bass Reeves was about 37 years old, in the full vigor of manhood. We don't know the exact words that passed between them, but we can imagine the scene. The U.S. Marshal arriving at Bass's farm, seeing the legendary figure in person, a broad-shouldered, dark-skinned man with a calm, steady gaze. Fagan likely outlined the job. The Indian Territory needed taming. It would be dangerous beyond measure, and Bass's unique expertise was needed. Many lawmen, black or white, would balk at such a proposition. The average life expectancy of a deputy in that territory was dismal. But Bass Reeves accepted the badge. Perhaps he felt a calling, a duty to protect the innocent from the kind of marauders he'd seen up close. Or perhaps the job simply paid better than farming, and he had many hungry mouths at home. One thing is certain, Bass was not one to back down from a challenge, and this would be the greatest of his life. And so, against all expectation in that day, Bass Reeves became a Deputy United States Marshal, one of the very first black lawmen west of the Mississippi. In a South still reeling from the Civil War, the sight of a black federal officer was astonishing. He was sworn in at Fort Smith. Imagine the sideways glances from some of the white townsfolk as this black deputy strode through town in a coat and hat, revolvers strapped to his hips. Some probably scoffed quietly, believing he wouldn't last a month. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Bass wasted no time proving himself. He was assigned a beat that spanned some 75,000 square miles of Indian Territory and beyond, a domain of prairies, mountains, and rivers larger than many states. Fort Smith would be his base of operations, but his true office was under the open sky. He set out on his first expedition with a pocket full of warrants, each bearing a name of a man sought for robbery, or assault, or murder. Typically, a deputy would also take along a wagon, a cook, maybe a posse man or two if available. Bass often traveled with one trusty companion, sometimes a Native American scout, other times a junior deputy, but many times it was just Bass Reeves alone against the wilderness. In those early days, he carried an old army revolver or two, a Winchester rifle, a stack of arrest warrants, and an abiding faith in his mission. He couldn't read or write, a legacy of being denied an education in slavery, but that didn't hinder him. Bass would have a literate colleague read the warrants aloud to him, and he'd commit every detail to memory. He made it a point of pride to be able to recite the exact language of the warrant to the fugitive once he found him. It lent a certain gravity to the moment, the outlaw hearing his crimes enumerated in a booming baritone from a man who wasn't even looking at a piece of paper. It also prevented mistakes. Bass never arrested the wrong man. Riding into the territory, Bass used all the skills he'd honed over the years. He traveled light and fast, sleeping under the stars, cooking his own meals over small campfires that wouldn't give away his position. He could navigate by instinct through trackless woods and open plains, recalling landmarks from his time living there. He soon became infamous for always finding his man. A gang might think they'd vanished into the marshes of the Red River, but Bass Reeves would appear like a specter at their camp. A murderer might hide out in the hills, only to wake up one morning staring at Bass's rifle barrel. One reason Bass was so successful was his ingenious use of disguise and deception. He turned his lack of official uniform and the low expectations people had of a black man into a weapon. If Bass needed information from a town, he might pose as a simple farmer passing through, ears open for gossip. If he was tracking fugitives who didn't know his face, he might dress up as a drifter or an outlaw himself to get close. He impersonated cowhands, preachers, vagabonds, and even fellow criminals on the run. It wasn't just play acting. Bass was utterly convincing. He could change his voice, slump his posture, adopt local dialects, whatever it took. One of Bass Reeves's most famous exploits came courtesy of these disguises. Two young brothers, the Brunter boys, had murdered a family in cold blood and fled into the territory. Bass vowed to bring them in. He knew they'd likely seek shelter with their mother, who lived in a remote cabin. So Bass hatched a plan. He left his horse some miles away and rolled in the dirt until he looked like a half-starved tramp. He donned old, torn clothes and even smeared his hands and face with ash to appear grimy and desperate. Unarmed, or rather, appearing unarmed, he limped up to the mother's cabin just before dusk, begging for something to eat. The Brunter brothers, hardened killers, saw only a harmless, starving old black man. They actually laughed and gave him supper, thinking it sport to feed this wretch. The mother offered him a corner of the floor to sleep on, and Bass thanked her kindly and lay down, feigning exhaustion. Late that night, after everyone fell asleep, Bass opened his eyes. He crept to where the brothers lay snoring, carefully eased his handcuffs out, and in one swift move snapped the irons onto both men's wrists, locking them together. Shocked awake, the brothers thrashed, but Bass already had his revolver out from under his coat. They realized with dawning horror that the beggar they had fed was Bass Reeves. That long trek back to Fort Smith with Bass driving them on horseback must have been the bitterest walk of their lives. Bass had captured them without firing a shot, using brains over bloodshed. Stories like that spread far and wide. Around Fort Smith, Bass became a legend in the making. Judge Parker was said to rely on him for the toughest assignments. Time and again, Bass Reeves would return from weeks in the field, weary and trail-worn, with a wagon full of outlaws clanking in shackles. Some he had to kill, only ever because they drew on him, and their bodies would be draped over pack mules. Most he took alive. In an era when many lawmen were quick on the trigger, Bass was notable for preferring live capture and lawful trials. Perhaps his background as someone who had been on the wrong side of unfair laws gave him a special respect for due process. None of that meant Bass was soft. He was as tough as rawhide and could be ferocious when needed. Once, he was pursuing a murderer named Perkins who absolutely refused to be taken in. Cornered in a shack, the outlaw made Bass promise that their showdown would be a duel, a quick-draw contest in the street, like some mythic Wild West scene. Bass obliged, stepping out into the dusty road while townsfolk hid behind barrels and shutters. Perkins came out, pistol in hand. The two men faced each other. The townsfolk held their breath. And then, like a crack of lightning, Perkins raised his gun, but Bass's draw was faster. A single shot later, Perkins fell dead. Bass Reeves stood over him, silently holstering his smoking revolver. The matter settled with brutal finality. Witnesses marveled at Bass's speed and nerve. Bass's gunning skills were indeed the stuff of legend. He practiced constantly. He could shoot equally well with his right or left hand, an ability few gunmen ever master. There are accounts that in competitive turkey shoots, Bass never missed, to the point that local shootists, embarrassed at being outdone by a black deputy, stopped inviting him. In one shooting contest, before he was unofficially barred, Bass hit the target dead on so many times the judge had to disqualify some shots as impossible flukes. They literally couldn't believe a man could shoot that well. But Bass Reeves did, day in and day out, when lives were on the line. For nearly 3 decades, Bass Reeves roamed the Badlands and border towns, an unwavering sentinel. He encountered some of the most notorious criminals of his day and brought them to justice one after another. There was Jim Webb, a deadly gunman who had murdered over a dozen people. Bass tracked and confronted him in a violent gunfight that left Webb dead and Bass without a scratch. Wiley Queen Bond, a horse thief and killer, tried to ambush Bass but ended up in shackles instead. The vicious Tom Story gang, which had terrorized ranches in eastern Texas, found their leader on the wrong end of Bass's gun. Bass surprised Tom Story on a lonely trail, and when Story went for his weapon, Bass was faster, ending the outlaw's career with one bullet. The rest of Story's gang, seeing their leader fall, scattered to the winds. By the 1880s, Bass Reeves's exploits had made him a terror to lawbreakers and a hero to honest folk across the territory. He was the man who would come for you, no matter who you were. If you robbed a bank in Indian Territory and fled to the hills, you might elude the local Indian police, you might dodge the state posses, but eventually you'd hear that Bass Reeves was on your trail, and then you knew your days of freedom were numbered. Some even chose to surrender peacefully once they realized Bass was after them, figuring it beat the alternative of possibly dying in a futile shootout. However, Bass Reeves's journey was not without its low points. The very system of justice he served could still betray him, even after all he'd done. In 1886, Bass was escorting some prisoners with the help of a cook, a posse cook who drove the supply wagon. The cook's name was William Leach. During the trip, something terrible happened. Leach was shot and killed. Accounts vary as to how. One story is that Leach and Bass got into a quarrel over the quality of the food or the allocation of rations, and in the heat of the moment Bass's temper flared. Another version, which Bass himself later asserted, is that he was cleaning his rifle or revolver when it accidentally discharged, the bullet striking Leach by pure misfortune. In either case, the result was the same. Bass Reeves was officially charged with murder. This was a staggering turn of events. Bass Reeves, the peerless deputy, the hero of countless manhunts, now found himself arrested by fellow lawmen and booked into the very jail where he had delivered so many outlaws. He was suspended from duty to await trial. One can only imagine the anguish and perhaps humiliation Bass felt. He had risked his life over and over for the law, and now that law put him in a cell, suspecting him of a crime. In Fort Smith, tongues wagged. Would Parker hang his own favorite deputy if found guilty? Was Bass Reeves, despite his impeccable record, going to face the gallows like so many others? The trial took place in 1887. By then, Judge Parker had fallen ill and did not preside. It was another judge in the saddle. Bass Reeves was defended by a top-notch attorney. In fact, the very former U.S. attorney who had worked with Judge Parker and knew Bass well, W.H. Clayton. In court, Clayton argued passionately that the shooting was a tragic accident. Bass Reeves took the stand and swore that he never meant to harm William Leach, that the gun had gone off by mistake. Bass's long career of honorable service spoke loudly on his behalf. Fellow deputies and upstanding citizens likely testified that Bass's character was beyond reproach, that gratuitous violence was not in his nature. After hearing all evidence, the jury found Bass Reeves not guilty. He was acquitted and free to go. That verdict must have brought immense relief. But the experience left a bitter taste. Bass had stared into the abyss of possibly losing his own life at the hands of the justice system he served. It was a reminder that even a man as respected as he was still vulnerable, especially as a black man, to being misunderstood or falsely judged. One different verdict, and history might have remembered Bass Reeves not as a legendary marshal, but as another criminal swinging from Judge Parker's gallows. It's chilling to contemplate. Bass, however, was not one to dwell on what-ifs. Cleared of charges, he immediately returned to duty as a deputy marshal. If some had doubted him during the trial, he won them back soon enough with yet more displays of dedication and fearlessness. As the 1890s rolled in, Bass Reeves kept writing and enforcing the law. His hair grew grayer, his face more lined, but age did not slow him. In 1893, the federal courts were reorganized and Bass was reassigned to the Eastern District, based in Paris, Texas for a short while. Later, he moved to the Muskogee Court in Indian Territory itself. Wherever Bass went, outlaws fell or surrendered. By the turn of the century, Bass Reeves had arrested thousands of criminals. The tales of his heroics could fill a book, and indeed they eventually have filled several. But perhaps the most heart-rending episode was one that tested not his gun hand or ingenuity, but his very soul. That was the matter of his son, Benny. Benny Reeves was one of Bass's younger children, likely in his early 20s around 1902. Despite being raised by a father whose life was a model of duty and discipline, Benny strayed onto a dark path. He got into a domestic dispute with his wife that spiraled out of control, and in a moment of rage or tragic foolishness, Benny shot and killed her. When Bass received the news, his heart must have broken. The legendary lawman who had apprehended so many murderers now had a murderer in his own family. Worse still, a warrant was issued for Benny's arrest, a warrant that landed on the desk of Marshal Leo Bennett in Muskogee, Bass's superior. Marshal Bennett and the other deputies hesitated. Who would dare serve this warrant? Who would tell Bass Reeves that his son was wanted for murder? It was a line none of them wanted to cross. When Bass rode into Muskogee and learned of the situation, he was faced with a choice that would have shaken any father. He could have easily stepped aside, allowed another officer to take the warrant, distanced himself from the terrible duty of arresting his own blood. Many would have understood if Bass had recused himself. But that wasn't Bass Reeves. His moral code ran bone deep. He took the warrant with his son's name on it and said, "I'll find him." For 2 weeks, Bass Reeves hunted for Benny. This was no triumphant chase, no clever ruse or furious gunfight. It was a sorrowful pursuit, a father seeking his wayward son. The details are sparse on how it ended. Some say Bass tracked Benny down and confronted him face to face. We can picture the scene. Benny, perhaps exhausted and guilt-ridden, sees his father step out from behind a tree, Colt in hand. There's no escape, no lie that will work, no fight he could win. Maybe Benny dropped to his knees in shame. Maybe Bass, with tears in his eyes, handcuffed his boy and whispered a prayer for forgiveness. Other accounts suggest Benny ultimately turned himself in, unable to live as a fugitive, knowing his own father was on his trail. Either way, Bass Reeves delivered Benny to Marshal Bennett and the justice system. It was said that of all the outlaws Bass ever brought in, taking in his own son cost him the most pain. Benny Reeves was tried and convicted of murder, sent to the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, to serve a life sentence. He would later be pardoned after about 11 years, reputedly becoming a model citizen thereafter, a small mercy Bass never lived to see. It's doubtful Bass ever spoke much about this ordeal, but those close to him later noted that nothing Bass Reeves ever did, not even his deadly gunfights, showed more courage and integrity than fulfilling that warrant. To place duty above even family is a line very few can walk. Bass walked it, heartbroken but unwavering. In 1907, a great change swept the land Bass had patrolled for so long. Oklahoma became an official state. Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory were no more, merged into the 46th star on the U.S. flag. With statehood came state law enforcement, and the era of the roaming deputy U.S. Marshal in those parts came to an end. Bass Reeves, now 68 years old, saw his federal authority expire. Dozens of new Oklahoma sheriffs and policemen took over, and there was little place for an aging black lawman in the new order, especially as the winds of Jim Crow segregation were blowing fiercely. Bass Reeves retired from the U.S. Marshal Service that year, closing a chapter of law enforcement history. But he wasn't done working. He moved into the city of Muskogee with his family and soon found a position as a patrolman on the Muskogee police force. Perhaps the city's leaders knew that having a living legend on the police roster would be a reassurance to the public. Or maybe Bass just needed the income, and there were still criminals to catch. Either way, in his late 60s, Bass Reeves donned a new uniform, likely for the first time, as marshals didn't have standard uniforms, and became Officer Reeves. Instead of riding a horse for weeks through the wilderness, he now walked a beat in a civilized town. But trouble had a way of disappearing wherever Bass was around. It was reported that during the 2 years Bass was a Muskogee policeman, not a single crime was committed on his watch. Who would dare cause mischief when Bass Reeves was patrolling the block? Young street toughs and would-be thieves, upon realizing that the old, tall black officer was the Bass Reeves, likely thought better of testing him. He had nothing left to prove, and yet he quietly continued serving and protecting a community, as was his nature. Time is the one enemy that even Bass Reeves could not outdraw. In 1909, his health began to fail. Bright's disease, an old term for chronic kidney illness, sapped his strength. This Iron Man of so many adventures was finally forced to lay down his badge for the last time. Bass Reeves died at his home in Muskogee on January 12, 1910. He was 71 years old. In the local paper, an obituary tried to capture the enormity of his life in a few words. He was absolutely fearless and knew no master but duty. That simple line says it all. Bass Reeves feared nothing and no one, except perhaps God and the weight of his own conscience. And he bowed to no master but the principle of right and wrong that he carried within him. Thus passed one of the greatest lawmen to ever live, and yet, in the years that followed, the world barely remembered his name. America entered the 20th century industrial age, and the wild frontier became a memory. The stories of the West were written and rewritten, but they tended to favor certain characters, the sheriffs and outlaws who fit a popular image. Black heroes like Bass were largely left out. His children and grandchildren kept his personal legacy alive in family lore, and old-timers around Oklahoma would tell tales of Bass Reeves around campfires and cracker barrels. But in textbooks, in novels, in the nation's collective memory, Bass Reeves faded into the background. It took nearly 100 years for Bass to get his due in the wider culture. Today, historians rank him alongside Wyatt Earp, while Bill Hickok and other giants of Western law enforcement. In truth, his accomplishments dwarf most of theirs. Wyatt Earp, for instance, was famous for a handful of gunfights and spent only a few years as a lawman. Bass Reeves served for 32 years and engaged in countless gunfights and dangerous missions. Yet for the longest time, Earp was a household name and Bass was not. Why? The answer, though uncomfortable, is evident. Bass Reeves was a black man in an era of entrenched racism, and for decades people could not reconcile that a black man could be the greatest hero of the Old West. So the history books glossed over him, and Hollywood all but ignored him. But truth finds a way. In recent years, books, documentaries, and even TV shows have begun to tell Bass's story. Statues of Bass Reeves now stand tall in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and in Muskogee, Oklahoma, the very places where once he delivered prisoners and walked his beat. His image, a bronze lawman on horseback, hat in hand, surveying the horizon, now greets visitors, ensuring that this great man is invisible no longer. The state of Oklahoma named a bridge after him, so anyone crossing the Arkansas River at Fort Smith literally travels in Bass Reeves's footsteps. Some have speculated that Bass Reeves may have been one of the inspirations for the fictional Lone Ranger. The comparison is intriguing. The Lone Ranger was a master of disguise, champion of justice, had a Native American partner, and rode across the West helping those in need. All things that echo Bass's real life. There is no definitive proof that the creators of the Lone Ranger had Bass in mind, but one could argue Bass's legacy is so powerful that it permeated the mythology of the West itself. Whether or not he inspired that character, Bass Reeves stands on his own. He needs no fictional proxy. His real deeds are as astounding as any legend. Why does Bass Reeves's story matter? Beyond its sheer excitement and drama, it's a powerful reminder of what an individual can accomplish against the odds. Bass started life in the absolute lowest station American society had, a black slave in the Deep South. He had no formal education, no wealth, and for his first 2 decades, not even ownership of his own life. Yet he found within himself the courage to seize freedom. He transformed himself into a protector, a symbol of honor and law on a lawless frontier. He dealt with constant prejudice, from outlaws who scoffed at a black lawman, from colleagues who might have doubted him at first, from a society that refused to fully acknowledge his heroism, and he overcame it all. Bass Reeves represents the triumph of dedication and integrity over the artificial divisions of race and class. Think of the thousands of criminals he apprehended. Each arrest meant a story ended. A murderer who wouldn't claim another victim, a thief who wouldn't steal from another traveler, a wife-beater taken off to face judgment, a bandit crew broken up. Bass Reeves directly saved lives by removing those threats. We'll never know how many families were spared tragedy because Bass put a man behind bars before he could harm again. The number is likely enormous. Consider also the inspiration Bass must have been to those who knew of him during his life. 4 black Americans in the late 19th century, hearing that a black man wore a federal badge and was the scourge of outlaws, had to kindle pride and hope. In an era of lynch mobs and institutionalized oppression, Bass Reeves was out there proving in the most unambiguous way that a black man could embody honor, bravery, and justice at the highest level. He didn't just shatter stereotypes. He ground them into dust under the hooves of his horse. Yet Bass was not an activist or a loud voice for social change. He changed perceptions by his actions and excellence. He demanded respect without ever saying it. He just showed it. And sure enough, he earned respect from all who dealt with him. Court records and accounts often note that Bass was respected by white and black alike, by Native Americans, by outlaws who lived to tell the tale of being captured by him. Criminals who Bass arrested often came to admire him, In that grudging way one admires the very thing that bested you. They knew Bass was fair. He didn't mistreat prisoners, didn't humiliate them. He even reportedly gave many a man a safe escort to jail without letting angry vigilante mobs near them. He believed in the process. Bass Reeves's life is timeless and heavy with meaning. It teaches that heroism isn't about who you appear to be, but what you do. It's about the choices you make when fate tests you. Bass faced death and hell many times, from the moment he raised a hand to his slave master, to showdowns with gunslingers half his age, to the agony of upholding the law against his own son. Every time, he chose duty, courage, and what he believed was right. He never grew rich. He never sought power beyond his badge. When he died, he wasn't famous outside his territory. He was a man who did his job so well that the world only later realized how extraordinary he truly was. They laughed at that dirty beggar once, not knowing they were laughing at a lion in ragged clothing. How many others underestimated Bass Reeves in his life? A fair few, certainly to their regret. But now, no one is laughing. Instead, we marvel and we remember. The world can ill afford to forget a man like this. In remembering Bass Reeves, we pay homage to the countless unsung figures who laid the foundations of law and order in America, often without thanks or praise. Bass Reeves stands among the legends of the American frontier, shoulder to shoulder with the Earps, the Mastersons, the Hickoks, and in truth, towering above most. At long last, the world is beginning to give Bass Reeves the honor he earned so many years ago. He was more than a lawman. He was a lesson, a living proof that justice and honor can rise up from the humblest beginnings and flourish against all odds. They laughed at him once. They will not laugh again. Instead, we now tell his story with reverence, and in doing so, ensure that history shines a light on the legacy of Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, the righteous, relentless lawman who showed everyone what true worth really is. He earned his place among the legends of the American frontier, and now, at last, the world must remember Bass Reeves.